Hi, you're watching The Real Vikings on the Time Team official YouTube channel with me, Tony Robinson. Legend has it that in 1066, a single crazed axe-wielding Viking held an entire army at bay up there on Stamford Bridge until he was speared from underneath by an English soldier floating downstream. For centuries, this notion of an axe-brandishing maniac has been the popular image of the Vikings. But now, new discoveries, fascinating archaeology and cutting-edge research are painting a different, much more complex picture. For a start, they didn't wear these. It's a dramatic, sometimes contradictory history, where stories of raids sit alongside tales of trade, savagery goes hand in hand with settlement, all bound up in spectacular poetry and exquisite craftsmanship. For the past year, Time Team have been at the heart of the latest digs and sniffing out the very best research into the Vikings to tell the real story of a group of people who made an emphatic and indelible mark on Britain. This is the island of Lindisfarne, and 1,000 years ago it was one of the holiest places in Britain. It's where the Lindisfarne Gospels were written and where the bones of the famous Saint St Cuthbert were kept. It was also the target of a notorious Viking attack in the year 793, a cataclysmic event that sent shockwaves through Europe and changed the course of our history.
Fierce foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria and wretchedly terrified the people. The ravaging of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter.
That description of the raid in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle over 1,000 years ago cemented the image of the Viking as a pagan marauder hell-bent on treasure-seeking and terror. And at the start of the Vikings' ventures into early medieval Britain, it's fair to say that that was a pretty accurate picture. They were non-Christian, they pillaged, and were pretty handy with a sword. The raid at Lindisfarne kicked off a 250-year period during which Vikings conquered half the country. But there's another, more surprising legacy of this invasion: a new culture. And over the last few years, archaeologists and historians have been building up a completely different image of the Vikings as peaceful settlers and traders. I get very confused by you academics sometimes, because half the time you seem to talk about the Vikings as though they really were incredibly bloodthirsty and we were right to be scared stiff of them. The rest of the time you're going, oh, no, it's all right. Actually, they were really nice farmers. Which is it?
I wouldn't have wanted to be sitting here at Lindisfarne when the Vikings turned up in 793. Let's get that clear. But plenty of other people came from Scandinavia for a variety of different reasons, and I think it would be wrong to label all of the people that came from Scandinavia as bloodthirsty murderers.
The word Viking literally means pirate, but today it's commonly used to describe all the different groups from Denmark, Norway and Sweden who started coming to Britain at the end of the 8th century, whether as farmers, merchants or as raiders. How many invaders are we talking about? Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands?
It's clear from the impact of the Scandinavians on the English language and on place names that it was a considerable number, thousands. And it's quite clear from looking at the distribution of place names, they settled in particular areas. So in some parts of northern and eastern England, there were dense concentrations of Scandinavian settlers.
This is York, and just 73 years after the bloody attack on Lindisfarne, a great Viking army invaded here. Easily accessible from the North Sea via the Humber estuary and River Ouse, York was a cosmopolitan centre of culture and wealth, and a very attractive prize. Living up to their warrior image, the Vikings won York from the Saxons and then waged a brutal 10-year campaign to conquer all of England. But in 878, they agreed a truce with the Saxon king Alfred, and England was cut into two, with the Vikings ruling a huge area called the Danelaw, with York, now renamed Jorvik, at its heart. In the 1970s, the city was the focus of an incredible excavation when archaeologists found part of a Viking street. Coppergate, or Street of the Cupmakers, stunned the world. Coppergate produced an incredible 40,000 finds and revealed that after the initial invasion, Vikings settled as peaceful, ordinary people who rebuilt the town. Richard Hall was the director of that iconic dig.
That is arguably the most exciting single object from the excavation. It's a coin die, very rare. You have a pair of them. This is actually the bottom one. You put a bit of silver on the top, another die on the top, and bang! And you make tens of thousands of coins with it. So technically, this is absolutely brilliant. This is a musical instrument, believe it or not. This is a slab of boxwood, and they've bored holes down in this. And it's like an old milk bottle. You blow across the top, and it plays.
Can I have a go?
Please do. For the first time, we characterised what the Viking age city was like.
Characterised it in what way?
Well, as this thriving, bustling street scene, people making things, selling things, importing things. Big, big city, growing under Viking control.
But the 1970s dig revealed only part of the picture of Viking York. Fast forward a few decades, and there's now another opportunity to open up a huge area near the Viking city centre. Hungate is uncharted territory lying next to the River Foss. Archaeologists are just midway through a 5-year project, and Time Team have taken them up on the offer to share what might be their best year yet. While Helen Geek explores the written sources, Phil Harding will get his hands dirty in the trenches. Meanwhile, Mick Aston's eager to explore the latest discoveries made about the city's Scandinavian inhabitants.
Have you actually got anything of the Viking period yet?
We do, Mick, and that's a good question because actually we're just coming into a space that is part of a sunken featured building. We actually have...
Under 10 feet of waterlogged soil are the remains of buildings, including this structure. Some 7 metres long and 4 metres wide, its basement, lined with timbers and with an earthen floor, is sunk 2 metres into the ground.
So the obvious question then, Pete, is how do you know that this is Viking?
Everything that we've recovered from the building and these posts in front of us are all oak.
Oh, so you can get a date out of it?
We can get brilliant dendro dates.
Yeah.
2 of the posts that we've already excavated even had the bark surviving. And we know that that tree was cut down in the summer of 969 AD.
Oh, the summer of 969?
Yeah.
That's brilliant, isn't it?
On the south side of this building, our planks, or the ones that we've recovered so far, were cut from trees that were grown in southeast England.
Right.
And they're reused ship timbers.
Good Lord, so a reused part of a boat, but with timbers that come from southeast England?
Yeah.
That's very unusual, isn't it?
For Viking Age York, it's unique.
And what is it? Is it a house or a shed or something?
The way it's been constructed suggests that it's just a cellar. It's a basement. It's somewhat like a warehouse, to tell you the truth.
Hungate's wet conditions means preservation here's pretty stunning. And as a 1,000-year-old timber from the warehouse comes out of the ground, Time Team's Phil is on hand.
Top end towards you. And there we go.
So is this going to be sawn timbers or is it going to be done using an axe?
This is all done using an axe.
That is incredible that you can get that level of
Yeah.
finish. God, hey, you can't dig your nail in it. I want to make a chair out of this.
With the upright post removed, part of the Saxon ship finally sees daylight.
Oh yes, isn't that beautiful?
Yeah. Well, you've got the classic sort of partly overlapped clinker-built timbers on here. So you've got the bottom edge of this slightly overlaps the top edge of that.
I mean, you can't say whether it's likely to be a merchantman or even a warship.
We don't know, unfortunately.
I want this to be a successor of King Alfred's navy, I really, really do.
Well, Phil, it's probably not King Alfred's ship recycled into the building, but the archaeologists believe numerous boats and goods would have been passing through this bustling site 1,000 years ago. In fact, remains of other buildings and finds suggest this whole area may have been set aside for merchants. It's revealing a rather rich Viking York, a vital trading centre. But while many were happy as peaceful settlers in York, a shocking discovery in Wales suggests other Viking warriors hadn't given up their exploits as heathen murderers.
If you want us to investigate more sites, you can make it happen. So, help us reach 10,000 members on Patreon.
According to some experts, we've got the Vikings all wrong. It's too simplistic to think of them just as bloodthirsty marauders bashing everybody and everything in their quest for booty. New archaeology offers a much more complex story, that they moved here, settled down and assimilated relatively quickly. But if that's true, why does this notion of the Viking as a farmer and trader always get trumped by the image of the ferocious Viking berserker? This one seems to be chewing the top of his own shield. Did they deliberately set out to look and behave fierce?
The berserker fit seems to involve chewing on shields like this chap, frothing at the mouth, howling like an animal, and generally displaying a lot of bestial behaviour. The goal there is quite clearly to bolster the morale of their own army, while at the same time intimidating the enemy army.
Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that our image of Vikings is dominated by violence. They themselves relished their bloodthirsty reputation and even wrote poetry about it. King Eric Bloodaxe was immortalised in the words of the equally scary-sounding Egil Skallagrimsson.
Vassa villa statha vithra darada, fergrams gludum, Gjörvangs rudum, thas I bluti, I brimmels muti, vulla of drumvi, und veum glumvi.
He's using rhyme. It must have been absolutely electrifying at the time, as well as the traditional alliteration.
That really is glorifying violence, isn't it?
You could say that, and that's exactly what a man like Eric Bloodaxe would love to hear. But to a certain extent, the ability to be a great war leader was a desirable thing in a king.
So do we put too much emphasis on the Vikings as violent people?
I think sometimes they are made to be more violent than anyone else, but violence was not unusual. It's just that the Danes, certainly in the earlier phases of the raiding, were much more efficient at the art of warfare.
But Mary, do you think that by saying that they're no worse or better than anybody else, do you think that that misses the point a bit?
And this raises an issue about how we sanitize the violence of the past. It is absolutely not acceptable to dress up as a Nazi right now, and I think there would be universal or worldwide consensus on that. But it is acceptable to walk around the streets of York in broad daylight dressed as a Viking. But I think it's important not to lose that sense of the complexity of the past.
We've clearly revelled in the glamorous violence of Vikings. Wagner's operas gave us grand Vikings in winged helmets, and the Nazis hijacked the valiant Viking warrior image for recruitment posters. And it's not just an image. There's archaeological proof that Vikings could be cold-blooded murderers. Llanbedagwch on the Isle of Anglesey in North Wales was a small 10th century settlement surrounded by a huge defensive wall. But archaeologists digging there in the late 1990s found a village annihilated and 5 bodies, including a child, casually buried in a shallow ditch. All the burials dated to a period of Viking attacks in the area.
We have an adult male, 35, 45 years old, thrown in on top of an adolescent. The upper burial was notable for the wrists may have been restrained behind the back.
Tied together. Yeah.
Tied together at that point.
Yeah.
It's not a natural position for a body, a loose, dead body to fall into. The only one possible injury is a blow across the left orbit of this skull, damaging the nasal area here from a pointed tool.
Yes.
There was another burial of an adult male, slightly older, 35, 45 years old, who was hunched over on one side, but his wrists came together in front of the body.
The front like that.
Traditionally, a Viking warrior would be buried with grave goods as weapons.
Yeah.
Clearly, we don't have that in this case.
No.
So we can rule out a Viking burying a Viking, and it's not a Welsh burial of kith and kin. So we're only left with one option, really.
And that's the disturbing conclusion. These people, potentially all related, fell victim to savage Viking raiders. But Vikings weren't just masters of warcraft. They led the way when it came to the craft of making weapons. At the Wallace Collection in London, metallurgist Alan Williams has been looking into the steel content of Viking swords and discovered that technologically, they were years ahead of their time.
Now, this is an example of the best sort of Viking sword.
It's rather pretty.
What is surprising is that it's very uniform. Now, that's a very homogeneous crucible steel of about 1% carbon, which is quite unlike any other medieval steel before or since until the Industrial Revolution.
That steel is as good as any made today and reveals the Vikings to have been supreme metalworkers. No wonder then that they saw their blacksmiths as semi-religious figures. A major pagan god worshipped by the Vikings was Thor, who carried a blacksmith's hammer as a symbol of power.
So were the smiths really important?
They were really important. It required a vast amount of skill, knowledge, access to specific iron alloys, bringing it all together. And that's what's great about the Vikings. They bring these different skills all together. Everything is embodied in the blacksmith's art, from producing something that is basically starts off as a red rock that comes out as a white metal and then is transformed yet again into these phenomenal cutting blades.
Armed with their incredible weapons, the Vikings were supremely confident invaders. And even though some were settling down and trading in parts of the north, others continued raiding in the south into the 900s. In Weymouth, a recent grisly discovery hit the headlines. Archaeologists were stunned when they unearthed a massacre, the shocking aftermath of a Viking raid.
Angela, this is just one of a number of burials from a remarkable site.
There were 51 skeletons in this pit, all young adult males. They had perhaps been stripped as well and all decapitated. We think that these individuals were executed.
Incredibly, the archaeologists suspect these individuals were actually Vikings, outnumbered victims of some seriously angry Anglo-Saxons. There are enough bodies to comprise one Viking raiding party, and they're the right age. The bodies are also buried on a town boundary, a significant spot where Saxons routinely executed criminals. But before execution, there was a horrific fight.
This is a thoracic vertebrae here.
So where's the...
Just about here.
So this is the back and the rib cage is going to be out there.
That's right.
Does that mean to say it's actually had to cut through the rib cage?
The lower rib cage, yes, just round about here.
When it came to decapitation, it was no holds barred.
This is a vertebrae from about here.
Right.
And you've got a slice from the front through towards the back.
Oh, I see. That's literally created by a sword blow.
Yes, that's a sword blow going through.
And after decapitation, the Saxons really twisted the knife.
This is the jaw. Again, we have slices right the way through. Now, that looks like it's come from the back, but this individual also has cuts to the vertebrae from the front.
Yeah, I mean, it's really been chopped right the way through here, hasn't it?
On
through
both sides.
and again on that side there.
A number of the skulls and jaws have this kind of pattern of injuries, and it seems to me that it's not related to the act of execution, to the removal of the head. It's almost like a kind of mutilation.
Everybody's got this amazing idea of these fearsome Viking warriors attacking monasteries and defenceless villages.
Mm-hmm. Well, they had a bad day.
Analysis of the teeth should confirm if these are Vikings. But this discovery is dramatic evidence of an extraordinarily violent society, whichever side you were on. But while vicious clashes were continuing in the south of Britain in the 10th century, further north, Vikings were putting their energies into craft instead of killing. Excavations in the Hungate area of York are now revealing just how much effort went into transforming the town into a major Viking centre. This was a bustling area, possibly where goods were shipped in and out, and where archaeologists have unearthed a Viking warehouse containing a very rare find.
Here we have a 1,000-year-old knife that, apart from a bit of surface concretion, is really in pretty good nick.
And an X-ray of the knife reveals it's a cut above the average blade.
What you can see is that there's a funny-looking band of lines running just below the top of the knife, like that. That's in sort of this position here on the knife. And I think those lines represent what we call pattern welding. Top-of-the-range metalworking technique gives the blade extra flexibility as well as strength, and that's very desirable in things like swords, where if you've got this long blade, you don't want to hit somebody and the thing just shatters. You want that bit of give and take in it. But it's pretty unusual in a knife. We don't know really whether a knife like this would actually, in effect, have been a much better working object. But there were people who wanted not just your common and garden £5 watch, they wanted the £500 watch. And I think it's the same with the knives. It was a way of flaunting your wealth and your position.
Pattern welding on a knife instead of a sword was effectively Viking bling. It was just showing off. But making it would have tested the most skilled of blacksmiths, as metalworker Andrew Bodley and his enthusiastic apprentice have been finding out.
There's a lot of work involved in it, and the other dangerous part is that all the way along, if you leave the metal in the forge too long, you can destroy hours of work very easily.
These 7 separate bars of steel and iron all have different qualities. But once welded and hammered together, they create a sharp, flexible blade with a distinctive pattern.
Oh, look at those sparks.
And hit. That's it.
Once hammered flat, the red-hot bar is twisted in a vise, welded to another piece of steel, and then shaped into a knife. But in a split second, it can all go horribly wrong.
Oh, jigger.
That's too hot. As a working knife, that's now kaput. You've damaged the structure inside the metal there. That's, as a working knife, that's throw it away, cut it off and go, throw it away.
Luckily, Andrew's got other irons in the fire and carries on with an unburnt blade. But it's a frustrating lesson in the difficulties of pattern welding. To speed up a process that would have taken days, we're prepared to cheat with some modern technology. An electric grinder to polish the knife, then acid to bring out the pattern.
Oh, wow. Now that is status. I mean, I can really appreciate why anybody owning one of those would be, you know, top of the society. That's great stuff. That's surely great stuff.
Evidence from York shows that by the mid-10th century, the Vikings here really were becoming a settled and civil people, and there was a market for posh metal objects, but not necessarily weapons. Because by this time, there's evidence of another revolution in Viking society. They were giving up their pagan gods, which included gods of fire and war, and embracing the rather gentler world of Christianity, where swords were unwelcome at a Sunday service. But at Middleton Church near York, there's evidence that finding God didn't mean forgetting your heritage.
Oh, wow, look at that, a Viking warrior.
That is tremendous.
That's wonderful, isn't it?
You can see he's probably wearing a helmet with the nose guard. Here is his shield, and then his sword, and then below that, the axe. You can see the axe head there. And on his lap, he's got a short sword or knife or dagger. And there's a great long spear there. Yeah. In many ways, the image is reminiscent of pagan warrior burials, because you get exactly the same arrangement of the dead person and all his equipment, but this clearly isn't. It's a Christian monument, which expresses both his Viking identity, but also his adherence to the new religion without seeing any real a problem between the two.
They seem to be very chameleon-like. They can fit in with whatever society they find themselves in.
They do, but I would almost put it the other way around. I say that they're actually very open to new ideas and willing to take on things that they come across, but they put their own stamp on it.
The Vikings were now attending churches instead of attacking them. They were showing a keenness to integrate. Maybe the era of the Viking warrior was coming to an end. They certainly seem to be eating rather well. Believe it or not, this came from a human. It's Viking poo, dates to around the 9th century. There's even a whole hazelnut in there somewhere. And there's plenty more where that came from.
So together we brought Time Team back, and now we're going to take Time Team to the next level. Help us achieve 10,000 ongoing members on Patreon.
This is a Viking basement. It's rather like a present-day walk-in fridge. It's damp and cold and secure, an ideal place for storing food and perishable goods. And archaeologists are digging one exactly like this right now in the centre of York. At this huge excavation in the Hungate area of the town, archaeologists have found the remains of 10th century Viking buildings with sunken basements, one of which was built using recycled timbers from a Saxon ship. It's compelling evidence that a century after arriving in York, the Vikings transformed what was wasteland here into a thriving, managed goods in and out area, packed with people. And at the back of the buildings, diggers have found what seems to be loads of cesspits.
Do you think that there would have been a superstructure to this?
Yeah, possibly. You don't need to go to this much effort to have something that you just can throw buckets of night soil into.
More interestingly here is a little part of a boiled egg. So a 1,000-year-old snack seems to have survived, which is quite nice.
Digging these pits lets the archaeologists get up close and really personal with the Vikings.
You can tell it's poo if you give it a bit of a break, and it's quite crumbly. It's normally green.
Yeah, someone went to the loo 1,000 years ago, and here we are digging up their poo. There is no dignity. And it's really smelly.
Literally every speck of cesspit waste can hold unsavoury clues about Viking health.
Can you see anything that's like a little slightly amber brown lump in there?
Slightly oval.
That's right, exactly.
I can see it.
That is an egg of an intestinal parasitic worm that lives in the gut of people that are passed with faeces.
And where are they picking this up from? Just in sanitary conditions?
Just in sanitary conditions, food that's contaminated with excrement, maybe small amounts, doesn't be smeared with it.
So what is that actually telling us about the population that was having these organisms in their guts?
Well, it tells us that they were parasitised. They're living in relatively unhygienic conditions by our standards. And together with the food remains that we've got, we can clearly say that this pit, this particular deposit, was used for the disposal of human excrement. So there was a sort of an organised way. People weren't just defecating indiscriminately. This stuff is being concentrated into particular features.
With well laid out warehouses and even organised cesspits, it's clear Hungate didn't develop as a haphazard sprawl. The site split into individual plots divided by gravel bands.
These seem to be fairly regularly spaced as you look up the excavation, and they seem to be alleyways giving access into the backlands behind the buildings that we've been excavating.
It does employ some serious town planning.
Well, I mean, I love the idea of Vikings coming along here with arranging rods and maps as town planners rather than the battle axes and so on. But yes, I think you can actually see sort of an organisation of the land within York and a plan to it all, using all this space down by the waterfront for industrial areas, laying out streets, commercial activity. That would be an ideal thing to do if you're planning space in an organisational sense.
But I don't think there was a guy who sat down and said, right, in 200 years' time I want it to look like this. I think that they recognised the topography, where the opportunities were, and they started to lay out streets, they started dividing up the properties, one man's plot from his neighbour's, and so it goes on. You can pick it up right across the frontage here. Very deliberate, very careful, very regular.
Vikings transformed the whole of York. Originally laid out on a Roman grid plan, the Vikings built curved streets to link new areas together. These erstwhile warriors were now putting their energies into expanding York and making money. And there was one item every discerning Viking desired.
Oh, wow, it's a bone comb. And it is complete, apart from just where they've lost a few teeth in there.
Hungate was home to comb making on a massive scale.
All of this antler came from one pit on the site. That pit was about the size of there to there on this table.
Good God. So are they more than just beautiful objects to comb your hair?
I think so. You can see how decorative they are, and that probably takes a day to put together from start to finish. And so these weren't roughly made tools for a job. They were something you showed off. You might well have hung it off your clothing. Hair has all sorts of importances in terms of status, in terms of power.
But if it boiled down to length of hair, I reckon I'd go down well in a Viking household.
I think you do well.
Alongside the combs, a jet pendant from nearby Whitby, buckles and an Irish clothespin show York was the place to come if you were a trader, especially if you came bearing exotic goods.
This is amber, isn't it?
It is, yes. These have all come from Hungate. Some of them have come out of the backfill of our Viking Age building. We have complete amber bead, part of a half of a larger amber bead here. And we also have a polished piece of amber, beautiful polished piece of amber.
It's like plastic.
It's a resin, like plastic is a resin. It's a natural resin. This has probably come from the Baltic, traded across hundreds of miles. But I think we're looking at tangible relationships between the southern Baltic and Jorvik dating back to the mid to late 10th century.
And an incredible unique glass bead from as far away as Egypt revealed York was plugged into a trade network that went much further afield. The city became a gateway to the wider world. Vikings ruled the waves, and as trailblazers in ship technology and navigation, they were sailing incredible distances, making the world a much smaller place. A pivotal point where all the major seaways crossed was Orkney. By the 9th century, these islands were an effective springboard from which the Vikings could launch expeditions and expand. But they were also places that Vikings settled and colonised wholesale within a few generations. Time Team's Mick Aston followed them on the Viking trail.
So what's the attraction of the Orkneys to the Vikings at that time?
When we're thinking about their expansion into the North Atlantic, for a start, it's very close.
Yes.
So it's only a day's or so sail away from Norway.
And if you look at the island groups like Orkney, Shetland, Faroes, Western Isles, Scandinavia, it's all sort of like a crossroads around Orkney, isn't it?
What was it Magnus Magnusson called it? Clapham Junction of the Viking world.
The Vikings are part of the fabric of these islands and have left stunning archaeology. There's one place you can even get inside the Viking mind. Maes Howe is a prehistoric burial chamber, but the Vikings saw it as a blank canvas and scribbled all over the walls.
Oh, this is rather spectacular, isn't it?
Well, what we've got in here is the largest collection of runes out with Scandinavia.
Oh, right.
These runes are really just basic graffiti. This one says, Ingebjorg the fair widow, many a woman has walked in here stooping, a great show-off, and it's signed by Erlinger.
Right, so what's going on?
Well, perhaps this rune over here might give you an idea. This one says, thorny bedded, Helgi carved.
Ah, that sounds like a euphemism for something.
Yes.
Right. How do we know that they are actually Vikings doing this?
We actually have the word Viking in one of the runes.
Where's that then?
So if you'd like to look up here.
Oh, I see, yes.
And it says a Viking came underneath into this place.
So they're actually calling themselves Vikings in the 12th century?
In this instance, yes.
Right. Extraordinary.
And these extraordinary people lived in extraordinary places. The Broch of Dearness is basically a big pillar of rock on the southern coast of Orkney. It's isolated, exposed, and 80 feet above the sea. But perched on top of the rock was a village of 30 Viking houses, and a team from Cambridge University are now excavating one of the biggest. This 10th century house was 11 metres long, with walls and roof made from turf and a gable entrance. Archaeologist James Gerard is in charge of the trench, a room with a stunning view.
So are we looking at a family home here, or just a place where warriors were?
Warriors have families.
Yeah.
They might be very nasty people in Wessex or Mercia, but they come back to a home life, and this is what we're looking at here.
There's evidence these houses were renovated and altered over 2 centuries, suggesting long-term occupation here, despite the gale force winds.
Whenever somebody asks me why here, you know, part of the answer, of course, is it is incredibly defensible.
Yeah.
It's got 30-metre cliffs all the way around it. The very difficult path you came up is the easiest access to the site, but it's got an incredible vantage in terms of dominating the maritime landscape and allowing you to see, and perhaps equally important, allowing you to be seen.
So what should I think of this site as then at the height of the Viking period?
As a chieftain settlement that would include his military retinue and their families, and as a base from which people would go out into the world. They might be engaging in trade, they may very well be engaged in piracy and in mercenary activity. And that's the way quite a substantial settlement could support itself on what is a stack 80 metres wide.
The chieftain's settlement at Dearness underlines how the Viking world worked. It wasn't just about great Viking armies capturing major towns. From staging posts like Orkney, small groups could join together to conquer, spread their influence, and trade across the globe. These are the sort of silver coins acquired, spent, and traded by the Vikings. And the fact that they're found all over the world is a big clue as to how vast the Viking trade networks really were. At the British Library, Helen's met up with Sam Newton and Professor James Montgomery, whose work has shed light on Viking trade with the Muslim Empire.
On the one hand, the Muslims are appalled by their lack of purity and their lack of cleanliness. On the other hand, they're impressed by their bravery and their capacity in battle. They're also very interested in the goods that they bring. They bring furs and skins, usually martens, beavers, squirrels possibly, and swords. They exchange these furs for what the Muslims refer to as silent property, i.e. money, and they tie the coins up in the waistband of their trousers.
Sam, do we have anything in the sagas or the other Scandinavian sources that corroborates what we hear from the Arabs?
Well, a wealth of references, details about the commodities being traded, the furs, the swords, the Frankish swords and Frankish spears are mentioned in quite a few of the sources. A measured view of the English sources would also emphasise this trading side, particularly the voyage of Uchtara, who gives us an account of his trading up into the White Sea, over into the Arctic Circle, and the great commodity he's bringing down from there is walrus ivory, which is very highly prized.
Literature and archaeology reveal that Vikings created an absolutely staggering network of trade routes across the entire globe, from Scandinavia to the Baltic, the Byzantine Empire, and even North America, and then to the Volga, the Caspian Sea, and the furthest reaches of the Eastern Islamic Empire. They covered literally thousands of miles.
This is a map. Effectively, it works very much in the same principle as the London Tube map. So one could go from Falak here to Douran to Pukarda and then Mocha. These would be local stopping points for merchants and caravans.
Hitching a ride with the Viking traders was Ibn Rooster, the Islamic equivalent of Ranulph Fiennes, who wrote a book in the 10th century that I'll leave James to pronounce the name of.
It is his Kitab al-A'laq al-Nafisa, the book of precious objects. Ibn Rushd says they're very hospitable, providing you haven't done any damage to any Viking previously. If you have, then they will be particularly inhospitable towards you. And it also mentions that they're as liable to do damage among themselves as they are to others, but when provoked, they will unite and be unstoppable. So Ibn Rushd gives us precisely this picture of an adaptable people who are prepared to do business in particular circumstances and on their terms, but once those terms are violated, then they won't hold back.
All sorts of goods and wealth from across the globe must have passed through these warehouses at Hungate. And just 20 miles away, in the middle of an empty field, metal detectorists recently found a spectacular silver gilt cup, crammed with over 685 pieces of precious metal. A perfect demonstration of the range and quality of what Vikings were trading. Conservators have hailed it the finest Viking hoard for 2 centuries. And among the finds now on display at Yorkshire Museum are unique coins from a previously unknown mint, a rare Russian gold arm ring and beautiful Irish jewellery. May I pick it up?
Of course, carefully.
It is beautiful, isn't it?
Well, as a museum curator, it's the perfect hoard, and you can tell a really interesting story about nearly every single bit of it.
What are these things on it?
It's got a whole series of little panels with animals, lions, deer, horse, goats, and surrounded by all kinds of plant ornament, vine scroll in particular. All of these have a Christian significance.
What do you think it was for?
Well, I think it was probably originally made for use in church ceremonies. It may have been made to hold the consecrated bread for the Mass.
So does that mean we can work out where it's likely to have come from?
The decoration that suggests that it was made somewhere in the Frankish Empire, quite possibly in Paris, and dates to the middle years of the 9th century.
The cup may well have been looted from a monastery, but the rest of the hoard is the product of sophisticated trade.
Here we've got coins that come from the Samoanid Empire, from what today is Iran. We've got coins, I think, from Afghanistan. We've got material that perhaps came from Russia, a bit of hack silver there that originated in Russia. We've got, again, bits of hack silver that come from Ireland. It's a real geographical hodgepodge of material that's ended up in this field in Yorkshire, all thanks to this enormously widespread Viking influence.
The extraordinary thing about it, to me, is that it epitomises so much of what we're learning about the Vikings, the politics, the trade, the world travel, the craftsmanship.
Absolutely, it's a perfect snapshot of the Viking Empire.
But this comfortable and wealthy Viking world was about to be rocked. As they entered the 11th century, they would once again have to go to war.
Join a thriving worldwide community of Time Team fans on Patreon. Your ongoing membership enables us to develop more sites and more episodes.
Over the past few months, Time Team has been delving into the latest discoveries and digs up and down Britain in a quest to understand the impact the Vikings really had on this country. In York, archaeologists have been excavating an area called Hungate, where they've uncovered a fantastically preserved Viking warehouse dating to the late 10th century. It's a dig that's transforming traditional thinking about the Vikings. Archaeologists here are painting a vivid picture of York as a prosperous trading mecca, a kind of virtual Viking capital, brimful of new ideas and industry and culture. York's status captured the attention of contemporary writers.
There's a lovely quote that's written at the end of the 10th century. The city rejoices in the multitude of its population, which counting men and women, but not infants, is numbered not less than 30,000.
That's massive, you know, though, isn't it? Because even though today a town of 30,000 people isn't huge, I mean, in those days that would have been
incredible.
That's right. And when the population of the whole country is probably, well, certainly no more than 5 million.
And he goes on to say, the city is crammed beyond expression and enriched with the treasures of merchants who come from all parts, but above all from the Danish people.
Months of excavation at Hungate have now filled in blanks in the archaeological picture of York.
It's not very often that you get a chance to stand within a 1,000-year-old building where you can see the walls of the wooden-lined timber around us. We have uncovered the entranceway that comes down into the building and the steps and the thresholds that people would have walked over to step into this space. It's here and it's fantastic.
In your mind's eye, how do you see this area all those hundreds of years ago in Viking time?
I think this area would have been amazingly colourful. We've got boats moored on the edge of the river, goods being traded up and down, and then alongside this you have houses and warehouses. And we now know that Jorvik is a lot bigger than previously expected. It's a big place, full of colour and life.
And it's kept the original Viking street plan and word gate, which means street, to this day. 200 years of Viking influence took York to its pinnacle as one of the most important towns in Britain. But while life on the ground was relatively harmonious, the ongoing power struggle at the top between Vikings and rival Anglo-Saxons never really stopped. And it culminated in the famous Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. The Vikings were outnumbered and outclassed by King Harold's Saxon army, who had ironically learned the art of war from the Vikings themselves. The Viking era was at an end. There was never a Viking empire, was there, in the same way that there was a Roman empire?
That's absolutely right, and I don't think there was ever any attempt for there to be a Scandinavian empire. There was no single ruler trying to create one. But that doesn't mean to say the legacy wasn't immense.
But come 1066 and the Norman conquest, the Vikings didn't get up and all leave the country, far from it. Proof can be seen in the names on an inscription from the time at this church in North Yorkshire.
We have 4 names here: Orm, Gamal, Hawarth, Brand, all 4 of them Old Norse or Scandinavian names. In Domesday Book, for every 1 Old English name, we find 9 Old Norse names.
It's evidence that many Vikings not only stayed put in this area, but also married the locals. And wherever they went, they left an enduring legacy. A legacy we've overlooked in our dismissal of Vikings as deadly but itinerant raiders.
On the whole, in Britain, people have been tolerant of newcomers and lived alongside them and learned how to live with them. And again, the Vikings really started that process, and it's been going on ever since then.
It's in the words Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Words like egg, knife, window, scant, even the pronouns they, them and their. Something in the region of 2,000 words in modern English come from Old Norse. It's Vicky the Viking, it's Marvel's Thor, it's American gods. They have left an imprint on our imagination and our life in almost a way that no other culture has.
Thanks to painstaking archaeology and stunning finds, our picture of the Vikings has been completely transformed. They're no longer historical caricatures, they're real people, and rather modern people actually. They're global traders, technological pioneers, and frightening invaders. A bit like the Americans really. And like the Americans too, you either love them or loathe them, depending on your point of view. But one thing's for certain, the Viking legacy has helped change the Britain we live in today. Join Time Team on Patreon to access exclusive 3D models, masterclasses and behind-the-scenes insights.